Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Dovolte mi poprvé v letošním roce vás přivítat v sále nejvyššího průkazství Pražského hradu na již tradičních přednáškách cyklu Věda na Hradě. Tyto přednášky si pro vás připravuje Správa Pražského hradu ve spolupráci s Ústavem organické chemie a biochemie Akademie věd České republiky, Univerzitou Karlovou a nadačním fondem IOCB Tech, kterým děkujeme za podporu tohoto cyklu. Je mi velkou ctí, že dnešním přednášejícím, kterého tady můžu přivítat, je pan profesor Jakub Kastl, který se chopí tématu, který už můžete vidět za mnou na plátnu. A já poprosím pana docenta Jakuba Steinera, jestli by nám dnešního přednášejícího v krátkosti představil. Přeji vám všem příjemný večer.
Dobrý večer. Je mojí ctí být ve skupině vědců, která vybírá přednášející do tohoto hradního cyklu. A v tomto výběru se řídíme dvěmi principy. Dbáme na společenskou relevaci daných témat a taky na vědeckou excelenci přednášejícího. V případě Jakuba Kastla, který bude přednášet dnes večer, jsme naštěstí nemuseli dělat žádný kompromis mezi těmito dvěmi kritérii. Jakub je špičkou ve svém oboru, což je ekonomie, světovou špičkou, a zároveň téma, které zkoumá, je velmi relevantní pro českou společenskou diskuzi. Jakub se zabývá oborem, který se možná česky řekne průmyslové organizace. Je to obor zkoumající firmy s tržní sílou a taky zkoumá to, jak tyto firmy tuto tržní sílu používají. Aplikovanou tváří tohoto oboru je ochrana tržní soutěže, která je v Čechách provozovaná zejména z perspektivy právní. Je provozovaná zejména právníky, a to možná i proto, že ekonomických expertů, kteří by v tomto smyslu mohli poradit, je v českém prostoru relativně málo. Což může být tím, že je to velmi těžký obor. Je to obor, který je postaven na teorii her, což je poměrně náročná matematická disciplína, ale moderní tvář tohoto oboru pracuje pečlivě s daty a používá poměrně sofistikované statistické metody a navíc vyžaduje od zkoumajícího vědce velice realistickou, podrobnou znalost zkoumaných průmyslových odvětví a takovouhle jako renesanční šíři zvládne málo kdo a tudíž bohužel té expertizy se v našem prostoru nedostává. Jakub Kastl vystudoval ekonomii, nebo počal své studium v ekonomie zde v Čechách, vystudoval bakaláře oboru ekonomie na Karlově univerzitě, poté se však přesunul do Ameriky, doktorát získal na Northwestern University, jeho první akademický job byl na Stanfordu a nyní se usadil na Princetonské univerzitě, kde má profesuru. Jakub se také alespoň částečně angažuje v českém prostoru, je členem správní rady CERGEI, což je ekonomický institut zde v Praze, a který tímto způsobem pomáhá řídit. Je v zájmu České ekonomické obce, aby Jakub svoje vztahy s Čechama a naší českou ekonomickou komunitou prohluboval, a já budu doufat, že i pozvání na tuto přednášku bude malá kapka, která tomuto pomůže. Jakube, floor is yours, zlom vás.
Takže dobrý večer, je mi velkou ctí tady na Hradě k vám mluvit. Děkuji moc Jakubovi za představení a já se asi omluvím, já přepnu do angličtiny hned, ale asi vidíte, proč budu muset mluvit anglicky, protože ani já nevím, jak bych Industrial Organization přeložil. Je to něco, s čím jsem bojoval už hodněkrát a vždycky se dostanu k něčemu jako ten dlouhý popis, který Jakub před chvílí předvedl. Takže teď se vrátím do angličtiny a začneme mluvit o Frontiers of Antitrust Economics. Vezmu si clicker and let's go. All right. So it turns out that around the world, economics and economists in particular are in the middle of the antitrust discourse and all the discussion about competition policy. And that includes US, includes the European Union. In fact, there's an Office of Chief Economist in the European Commission. And this has been this way for probably the past 30 years. I have added here a couple sites. So Tim Muris was the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of the bodies in the US that deals with antitrust. And he's actually a lawyer. He's a professor at George Mason. And he himself realized that it's no longer a question whether economics should guide antitrust policy. That debate was settled long ago. The pressing question today is how. So today what we're going to be focusing on is to try to answer that. So how can economists help antitrust enforcement and antitrust design? So I already mentioned FTC. The other major institution in the United States is called the Department of Justice. We'll see how it will do during the next administration. But within this Department of Justice, there is a bureau which is called Economic Analysis Group. And this Economic Analysis Group consists of about 60 economists, 60 PhD economists, who try to sort of provide guidance around roughly these 6 points. They try to model competition to facts of the industry. So as Jakub said, part of I.O. is to actually try to learn the institutional details of every particular industry we're trying to study. So there's 60 people that devote their time to do that. They try to then develop quantitative evidence, trying to find out whether market power could be abused potentially, or whether collusion could take place, and things like that. They evaluate efficiency and entry claims. So very frequently parties that want to merge, an example that we're going to study in a little bit in more detail, they always argue that you should really allow us to merge because we're going to be able to provide or produce all the goods so much more efficiently. We're going to save on shipping costs. We're going to save on managerial costs. So all kinds of savings are going to be realized. And therefore, if you allow us to merge, we might raise prices a little bit, but not much, because costs are going to go down so much that there is going to be a sort of a countervailing effect. Well, they also try to work with lawyers. They typically, each of them work with a group of lawyers that try to sort of build cases and fit the analysis with case law. Again, something we're going to come back to. And if actually a case is brought up to court, they actually do provide economic expert testimony. They either support it, they provide it outright. Okay? Importantly, they actually work with academics, something which is not very common in the Czech Republic and, in fact, most of Europe. So, it's sort of like a bi-directional cooperation. Academics often go to these bodies and serve for a year or two as chief economists, or, in fact, within the Department of Justice, there is a position of deputy assistant attorney general, which is a position for an academic who is sort of like a director of this economic analysis group in some sense. And typically, this is an academic from one of the top institutions that sort of guides these 60 economists in conducting all these 6 points. Okay. So let's go and start zooming in. So what I want to do today is sort of talk about a couple examples, or if you want, case studies, of how the modern way of thinking about markets can guide antitrust policy. We're going to start with horizontal mergers. So I'm going to give you a very simple, in fact, you're going to be able to see yourself once I show you some graphs that something weird is going on in a market that we all love, which will be beer. And after that, we're going to talk about platforms. All right, so in order to talk about mergers, I need to start defining things. So I'm going to first turn to the Clayton Act, which is one of the major bodies of one of the major laws that the U.S. Legal system has at its disposal to fight against market power abuse. And there's a Section 7, okay, I'm trying to see, okay, there it is. Section 7 of this Clayton Act, which specifically says that any acquisition is prohibited if the effect of such acquisition may be substantially to lessen competition or to tend to create a monopoly. So the key phrase that I want to focus on is lessen competition, all right? So you all probably have some intuitive sense what lessen competition is, but if you wanted to go to court and say, T-Mobile cannot buy AT&T or vice versa, you have to be able to define that. You have to be able to quantify these things. And so that's one. So we have to be able to talk about what lessening competition means. Two, and perhaps more importantly, notice that the legal standard here, what the law says, is not that prices are higher or lower, or that quality is going to be higher or lower, or that there is some other impact of the merger, but it is focusing on this lessening of competition. Okay? So what we're going to do today is try to, now in the next probably 10 minutes or 5 minutes, I'm going to try to define how to use an economic model, or show you how to use an economic model to talk about what lessening competition is, and then we're going to go ahead and start measuring it. Okay? And we're going to use this beer market example to start measuring it. Okay. So I call this title, or I call this slide, Simple Economics of Horizontal Mergers, but those of you who did some undergraduate economics already probably recognize graphs of this sort right away. So this is a demand curve, okay? And I'm going to use this graph to define what lessening competition is going to mean. Okay? It's going to take me 2 slides. So let's think about the market. Let's imagine we are interested in selling beer, okay? So what price should firm A charge for its product? Well, normally, a firm probably is going to take into account some cost, and it's going to take into account how the choice of the price is going to impact the number of units they can sell. Okay, so that's a simple exercise that they have to go through. So if they were to raise the price, profits are going to go up, for all the units that they are able to sell. But because prices are higher, well, they're going to be able to sell fewer units at that point. Okay, and so what this seller is going to do is essentially balance these 2 effects. And again, if you recognize this graph, the optimal point that this firm will choose is at the intersection of where its cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve. Okay? I'll come back to that on the next slide. All right, so it's the same graph. And now I just, to show you that there is some math that underlies this analysis, this is a very simple sort of a first-order condition from profit maximization that I don't want to really comment on. But the important comment I want to make is that it can be rearranged to generate an equation which is called the inverse elasticity pricing rule. What this equation tells you is that any firm that is optimizing its price is going to take into account its cost and then this elasticity of demand. And look, the elasticity of demand, essentially you can think about it as how quickly consumers are going to move elsewhere, right? So for economists in here, we know that elasticity is defined as a percent change in some variable as a function, or rather percent change in a variable induced by a percent changed in another variable. So this is a price elasticity of demand, which again is a percent change in quantities induced by a percent change in price. So any firm would choose its prices to satisfy this equation right here. Okay, now suppose a firm merges. Okay, so suppose firms A and 2 are going to become 1. So as before, what would this merged firm do? So it's going to think about if I'm going to raise the price, my profits are going to go up for all the units I'm selling. Very nice, as before. But now there's this additional channel. So if some people decide to stop buying my product because the price is higher, and they're going to go to the competitor, they're going to go to buy the other product. Well, now, because I've merged, I'm going to keep some of them because they're going to be buying the product of firm B. Okay? So these units are actually not sold, or all that revenue is not really lost at that point. So this is something which in the legal literature, or in this antitrust setting, is typically called upward pricing pressure, sometimes it is presented as diversion ratio. So it's the number of that's a fraction of consumers that go to another product. And the point is that this merger allows the firm A and B to internalize this externality between the 2 products. Okay, so this loss of sales due to price going up is going to be partially offset by the sales going to another product I own. Okay? And now, if you think about that a little bit, this is exactly the competition that is lost. Right? So if these 2 firms merge, these consumers that go to another product that this merged
firm has, that's precisely the competition that was lost because of the merger. Okay, so that's the underlying intuition. And now, what this Office of Economists within the DOJ does is provide the lawyers with, merger simulations. Suppose there was a sort of a proposed merger between two large companies, AT&T and T-Mobile are a good example. What this office would do is try to think about a counterfactual world. Counterfactual, sometimes we think about it as a world that would happen or what if world, if that merger were to happen, and build models so that we can think about what the prices would look like if that merger was allowed. Okay? So what this does is essentially we're going to try to map institutions of a particular market. So in the cellular case, it would be somewhat more complicated than the simple market we just described, but the logic would be the same. We're going to try to get to some equations of this sort and think about what price AT&T would charge, what price the merged entity would charge if we were to allow the merger to go through. Okay. So what this merger simulation involves then is essentially setting up a bunch of equations, solving them jointly, and then doing some accounting work. So doing some simple algebra, or asking the computer rather, to do the algebra for you. And this, in principle, can be very complicated. There have been cases, for example, where hospitals were asking to merge, where, again, the pricing behavior is very different from the simple one that we described on the previous slide. But the logic is the same. Once we decide what the right profit function and what the right strategy to optimize over for a hospital is, the logic that we're going to try to go through as we simulate the proposed merger is the same. Okay? So we're going to try to predict post-merger prices and try to compare them to pre-merger prices and think about, whether the world will be worse off or better off depending on what we actually care about. Now notice that this is all nice and great, but there is a big question here, and that is where do we get the inputs? Right? So because on the previous, again, if I go back to the equation that I was sort of focusing on before, there are these costs and there is this elasticity. Prices, at least current prices, we do see. Right? So that's the easy part. But the elasticity we don't see, that's some sort of an object that we need to recover. And the costs we typically don't see. The accounting costs are a pretty crappy measure of anything, as we all know, because companies have all kinds of reasons to, misreport. So we need to do a little bit, we need to do a lot more work to get at these two things. But ultimately, to conduct this merger simulation, this is what we are going to try to do. Okay, so we're almost ready to get to our first case study. So let me just define I/O now. In a slightly different way again. Okay, so I/O is really a branch of economics that looks at antitrust and competition, and the current focus of the field is really on estimating consumer demand. So how do we get real-world data and turn it into these elasticities and substitution patterns, so that we can learn about, okay, if the price of butter were to go up, by 10%, how would the quantity of butter sold change, okay? Or if a particular brand of car, let's say Škoda, raised their price by 10%, where would these people go? How many people would stop buying cars? How many people would start buying Mercedes? How many people would start buying Porsche? And so on. So that's precisely what that field studies. Other than focusing on demand systems, we also focus on the mode of competition. So we are trying to think about whether firms compete in vertical chains, whether hospitals buy drugs from pharmacies or drug producers and at the same time sell them to consumers through insurance plans and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's all part of this field. But most of this work is really about carefully writing down models that can be then brought to data so that we can get estimates of these parameters such as this elasticity or costs based on real data. And for the students in the room, this is really an exciting field because there is a huge, increase in availability of data. And this, together with the, much improved computational resources and the abundance of, experts, maybe not here, but at least in the US, that all contributes to a big empirical wave. Very good. So now, let me turn to the first case study. Okay, so I want to focus on beer. Okay, so now you see that these are beers that most of you probably have never tried, and believe me, you would not want to try them. But this is what we're going to focus on. All right, so look, this is two graphs that are supposed to immediately show you that something weird is going on. Okay, so left graph is this graph right here. It's actually, these are prices of these three beers. Okay, and you see that sort of, this is weekly deflated prices, so don't worry about inflation or anything like that. This is actually monthly, I think. But sort of you see that sort of these prices move together all the way to this red curve, and then all of a sudden they move up. Okay, so all these three beers. In the right, I have a subset of these. I have, I guess, Heineken and then Corona, which is in the back. But you see that, again, they're going sort of down all the way to the red curve, and they actually keep going down after. So what is that red line? Okay, and so this is something that probably, if you were the DOJ, that's something that you probably would want to know. Well, it turns out that this is a merger, okay? And it turns out it's a merger that DOJ itself approved. Okay, so now we have the benefit of looking back, 15 years and trying to think about should they have approved it. Okay, so let's do that. Very good. So you see, so this red line that I had in the previous picture is actually a merger agreement that Miller and Coors, so those two beers in that picture, signed in June. And that led to average increase in prices of about roughly 7-8%. Okay? And in fact, markups went up as well. Now, you got to ask, why did the DOJ allow it? After all, this was the second and third, I'll show you the market shares in a little bit, but this was the second and third largest producer of beers in the US. Okay? So let's look at the data. We're going to follow roughly what the economists in that economic group within the DOJ would do. And so this data, which is available for many countries by now, is basically, you can think about a scanner data set from a big subset of supermarkets around the country. It could include, for every UPC code, so all kinds of combinations of bottles or whatnot, weeks and stores, its sales. So prices, quantities, and so on. So here we're going to look at the period between 2001 and 2011 so that we have the merger in between. And because we're going to look back, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to use the pre-merger data to estimate our elasticities, estimate our costs, and try to look forward. What our model would predict in terms of the behavior of prices, not only of the merging parties, but also of the not merging parties. And we're going to see what model we would need to put down so that we can sort of fit this pattern, okay? Very good. So, we're going to estimate these elasticities, substitution patterns. So there is a whole cottage industry within I/O that deals with how to do that. I'm not going to bother you with all the details. I'm going to come back to some of the details in the second part of the talk when we talk about platforms. Okay, so I promised market share. So this is just for those of you who don't know the US beer market from like 15 years ago. This is how it looked. So Budweiser, so this is ABI, had like roughly over a third of the market, and Miller and Coors combined for roughly the same market share, okay? And then the rest were much smaller. Okay? So that's what the situation was. Note, by the way, as I say here in that smaller part of the, or lower part of the slide, you see that sort of the market share of Miller and Coors remained roughly constant even after the company merged. Okay? So why did the DOJ allow it? Well, it turns out that Miller and Coors argued, and rightfully so, that they're going to be able to save a lot in terms of shipping costs because now they don't need to brew the beer in their own brewery. They can start brewing the beer in the other guy's brewery. So Coors, which is rough, a lot of the Coors breweries are in Colorado on the West Coast. A lot of Miller breweries were on the East Coast. So that seems like it's a huge potential for cost savings there, as DOJ argued. Second, DOJ concluded that actually both Miller and Coors competed, at least before the merger, much more strongly with Bud than with each other. Again, because they were mostly geographically separated, it was concluded that the competition is much fiercer with Bud, and hence allowing them to merge is unlikely to lead to any important changes in prices. But as we saw, that was a mistake. Okay, so why is it? Okay, so now this, you don't have to worry about this table too much, but this essentially is doing some black boxy estimation routine, which results in a bunch of elasticities. Okay, that's what I said, that sort of this whole cottage industry on demand estimation does. So we use this weekly data where prices are moving around, quantities are moving around, and people are buying different things around the country in order to infer what preferences people might have for the different beers. And that's going to be our important input in trying to think about what's going to happen after the merger is allowed and is going to go through. Okay? So importantly, in the models that we write, both products and consumers are allowed to differ. Okay? So beers differ in their calorie content, in their taste. It's somewhat difficult question that you always have to sort of go through as you start designing these models is really to choose the proper, what we call characteristic space for the goods. So we need to be able to map different beers to different. Okay, so this was actually my phone. Sorry about that. We have to map these beers into different characteristic spaces. So we have to be able to decide how do we compare Corona with Heineken other than just by its brand. Even though, of course, the brand itself can be one of the characteristics itself. The only important takeaway I want to highlight here from the numbers, if you can see them at all, is that, well, the own price elasticity, which is how much decrease, or how much quantity goes down if price goes up, is much higher than the market price elasticity, which suggests that if the aggregate prices go up, most people are going to start substituting within inside good. So we're going to start buying different beers rather than going to substitute away from beer altogether. Okay? Very good. So this is the outcome of the different models that I want to go through. Okay? So remember, this is the other direction. This is our starting point. We use this data to estimate the elasticities and costs. And now we're going to try to solve these equations that predict prices after the merger for different scenarios. One scenario will be, well, let's try to think about the cost synergies, the cost efficiencies that these two companies claimed they're going to incur. And let's think about what predicted Bud price we should see if competition is decreased only because these two companies merged. Okay? Now, that's going to be one of these lines. Let me maybe focus, maybe zoom in here. All right, very good. So this is Miller Lite price as our model predicts this. This is actually from a recent paper, or no, well, not so recent anymore, by Nate Miller and Matt Weinberg, okay, so the black line, that's the real data. Okay, so as I said, there's data that goes all the way to the merger, then the parties merge, and the data starts continues up at roughly the 7% higher. Okay? So what our model predicts, if we only have the cost synergies and we have nothing else, is this blue curve. Okay, so this unilateral efficiencies curve, this dark blue curve here, well, that's a line that's pretty close to what the model would predict if no merger happened. Okay, so the cost synergies are actually, if the cost synergies were such as Coors and Miller were arguing, we should see prices not moving too much. Okay, they would have totally, preferred to set almost the same price as they did before. Their profits would go up because costs would have gone down. Okay, so clearly that's far away from the data. right? So what else could have gone? What else could have happened? Okay, if there were no cost efficiencies, that's this darker curve here, well, now we're much closer to the raw data. But we know that's unlikely because some cost efficiencies should have happened. Okay, so that's unlikely that that would explain this black curve. On the other hand, you know, there is a good reason to believe that if you reduce the number of companies from 3 to 2, it's much easier for the 2 remaining companies to start doing all kinds of dynamic tweaking of prices so that we end up at some point where both of us are happy. Okay? So if you think about Bud Light, I'm going to tell you in a little bit how this model captures that, but let's think about the same picture as before, but now for Bud Light. Again, this is a company that didn't merge, right? So now they should be facing still competition from a party that has lower costs now, okay? And so if you follow the raw data curve, again, there's just the black curve here, it's very different from what the situation without a merger would predict, or whether or not efficiencies were realized by course. So you see that sort of that model must have missed something. So when the DOJ was writing down these equations and solving for the prices, trying to do the merger simulation, they missed something. What did they miss? Well, we can bring into the model what's called coordinated effects. Okay, so this makes the model more complicated. Roughly, you can think about this as we are going to put weight on the other company's profits. And if you do that, you see that the model captures the data really perfectly. So this is like, if you want a reduced form way, how to capture some dynamic incentives that the 2 companies would engage in a little bit later on. Okay? So this should illustrate, or what you might want to take away from this is that writing different models allows the DOJ or whatever antitrust authority you have to construct different scenarios of what the world would look like if the merger was allowed. And then once we have that data, we can have discussion about which of these, without having the black curve, without having the benefit of seeing the data ex post, we should have a discussion about which of these is most likely and which of these we like or we don't like. Okay? Here, what I'm showing you is we have the benefit of seeing the data ex post. So sort of if I were to show you this picture, obviously we all would have picked the red curve. But normally when we decide on whether or not to approve a merger, we wouldn't have that. All right. So that's mergers. Notice that what this also allows us to claim is that these efficiency gains from the merger that the DOJ assigned were likely overestimated. And you know, it's this Bud Light prices were increasing much, much more than what a model with a unilateral equilibrium adjustment effect would predict. All right. I'm going to now turn to the second case study and talk about platform pricing. So most of you probably know what platforms are. In fact, today, most markets, or well, many markets, most markets in the gig economy anyway, are organized on some sort of a platform that matches supply and demand. Okay? The question that I want to think about today as we go through some measurements again is whether or not we should give platforms all the freedom to choose prices in any way. Okay? And so what I'm going to be particularly focusing on towards the end is think about the value of information about consumers. Okay? Again, you will hopefully recognize the platform right away that I'm going to focus on. Anybody here who does not recognize this? All right, there are people who don't know Liftago, obviously. So this is a platform that operates here in Prague, right? And it's a platform that allows, you know, consumers to request rides and then being matched with a cab driver. And perhaps more importantly, it allows the cab drivers to compete for consumers. Okay, so you know, in this particular example, this is actually a screenshot from my own phone. You know, I wanted to go from the airport. Well, here I actually originally put my home address, but then I realized I want to have it up, so I erased it. And I requested a ride. You can see I live pretty far away from the airport based on the price. So, I requested a ride, and then, in a matter of minutes, you get a bunch of offers from drivers among which you can choose. You can choose none of them, or you can choose one of them. If you choose one, a match occurs, and you get a ride. So what I want to think about is how I can use this data to start to simulate the world in which the platform would do something else. You probably know that Uber operates in a very different way, or Bolt, or all these other alternatives, right? There is no set of offers that you get when you request a ride. Bolt looks at where you want to go, and it tells you a price. You like it, you don't like it, you choose, but you get just one choice, okay? Whereas in this case, we see we have a choice, what we typically call a choice set. We observe a bunch of different goods in this case. I want a ride from the airport home. A different good is characterized by a different car, by a different rating that car has, and more importantly, by price and how long I have to wait before the car gets here. Okay? And now what we're going to try to do is try to use this data, and I'll tell you how rich this data is in a little bit, to again construct our estimates of demand side. We're going to construct our estimates of supply side of this market, so where the caps are and how the caps behave. And then we're going to play games with the platform itself. We're going to change what we allow the platform to see, what we allow the platform to price, and how we allow the platform to price. And hopefully by the end of today, I'll convince you that this market, where you actually get drivers competing for passengers, is really good for us, passengers. In fact, it's good for the world, okay? Whereas what Uber does, it's terrible for the world. And it's going to be worse and worse, okay? And again, because the pricing that they're going to be able to do is going to lead to very high prices and very high substitution to the outside good, us not taking Uber anymore. And for those of you who have sort of lived abroad, especially in the US, you probably would have already experienced it. So Uber raised prices over the last 2 or 3 years, maybe not multiple times, but certainly 10-20%. And it's getting much closer to what used to be called a black car service, i.e. a car service that you order rather than a gig economy type of a service. Okay, so let's go through it. So let's start with Liftago. By the way, I should have said, this is based, these are going to be, some extra analysis which is originally based on, data that I acquired with Philip and a bunch of colleagues from Princeton and MIT that we used for one of our papers, which is mostly focusing on the value of time. All right. So the sample, the data that I'm going to use to try to infer this demand system, which is again an input in any kind of antitrust analysis, is coming. It's essentially everything that Liftago has for several months. So if you ever took Liftago in, I guess, at some point in 2018, let's say, you would be in our data set. We wouldn't know the name, but you would have been assigned some sort of an ID, which we would be able to see over time, and you would be within our data. Okay? So we actually have roughly 2 million ride requests that result in 1 million rides and about 6 million, cab drivers bid for these rides. So you see everything that I had on the previous slide. You see prices, you see waiting times, and you see, ratings and car types, all of that. You see GPS coordinates of origin and destination, and because all of the drivers and all of the passengers have anonymized ID, you actually have a beautiful panel. Okay? So you have a nice data set that you can start using to analyze this market. Okay, so again, these are just some aggregate statistics so that we all know what we're going to talk about. So average price of a trip on Liftago is roughly $9 back then. So think 200 korunas. The bid is roughly $12. Okay, so the chosen is obviously lower, and roughly people tend to wait about 7 minutes. on average. All right. Now, this is quite a beautiful data set because it allows us to estimate very precisely the demand system itself. Why? Well, because if you think about, okay, so let me come back to this slide later, but if you think about what you're trying to model, it is something like a problem of a consumer that tries to choose the best of the J options that we see on the screen. So all these riders or these drivers that offered their ride on the right of the screen that we saw before. And the way we're going to think about each of these options is as mapping somehow the wait time that we see, the prices that we see, maybe the car characteristics and so on that we see to some value of that option itself. Okay, this is called a random utility model. Because we are going to stick in some stochastic, some random part of the utility that allows us to match the choices that otherwise wouldn't be explainable by the variables that we see. Okay, this is actually, it turns out that for a particular, this is a complicated problem to solve. This has been sort of addressed in statistics and in econometrics over 40 years ago. In fact, Dan McFadden got a Nobel Prize partially for showing that for a particular functional form of this epsilon, this discrete choice problem has a closed form solution. Okay, so anyway, something which we don't have to worry about today. But the point is that the screen data, the repeated screen data I showed you before, can be turned into estimates of these parameters of this utility function, of this problem. And this, in fact, is something which is going to give rise to the demand. It's going to tell us if prices were to go up by a little bit, how many people are going to start choosing not to take Liftago at all. If a particular driver with particular access were to raise the price a little bit, how many people would now be more likely to move somewhere else? Okay. Now, going back to the previous slide that I promised to come back to, this just shows us that something that probably you would have expected. Something that if I were to ask you, where do you think people are more likely to pick cheapest trips? Okay? When is it going to be within a day? Okay? So the x-axis here are hours of day. And you can see that sort of it's much more likely people choose minimal price in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night, okay, than it is during work hours. So if you are in a rush and you really want to go somewhere, price is not your first concern. Okay? On the other, and same with waiting times. Okay? We are much more likely to pick the minimum waiting time out of the options that we have if we are sort of during working hours. So patterns of this sort is what this data reveals, and it already tells you that both waiting time and price are going to be important determinants of the demand. Okay, so it turns out that this panel structure, the fact that we see people repeatedly, and we see them making repeated choices from different choice sets, so we see variation in what cars they choose from and what prices they face and waiting times they face, that allows us to estimate these parameters essentially on individual level. So I can sort of use that if say, Jakub were to take Liftago 100 times within my data set, I would have a pretty good idea what his tastes for waiting and tastes for prices are. I would know that if price went up by 10%, how likely Jakub is to move out of this market. Okay? And I can do it for everybody within this sample. So that's what sort of this detailed data allows you to do. Again, I'm not going to talk about the estimation method, but I want to contrast what a detailed data set like this, where you see individuals making repeated choices, allows you to do relative to what we had before. In the beer case study, this supermarket data allows you to see aggregate market shares of Bud Light, Corona, and Heineken moving around as the relative prices move over time, but not much more. So it's much less rich in terms of how much you can recover in terms of the individual preferences. Okay, so again, recall that the data, we're sort of unpacking it to get this demand system. So the demand system, after we sort of run it through this black box of a model, this bunch of equations, results in elasticities. So this is us in Prague, the population of people that take Liftago. On average, our price elasticity is 4. Waiting time elasticity is 9. Numbers are not important. What's important from looking at this is that people care much more about price than about waiting time in the data. Something that probably we all would agree, something that might be due to the fact that the waiting times, are fairly tight. You typically choose between 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. That 1 minute is probably not the biggest of your concerns. Whereas prices might differ by the order of, 30, 40, 50%. So indeed, that's not that surprising. Okay. What is important for us? Because we're ultimately going to play these games with the platform, allowing it to price the information that they might get. The important consideration is that this heterogeneity in taste for price and taste for waiting time is quite vast. Okay? So it's quite big. So there is a lot of potential of the platform using the fact that Jakub might be really price sensitive, whereas, I might be really insensitive. And so then if the platform knew that, potentially they can charge us very different prices. And again, the goal of the exercise, the name of the game for today is try to put numbers on that. How much can the platform gain if they're going to use this sort of information? Okay, supply. Because I'm going to be changing rules of that market, we have to be able to think about how the cabs, how the taxi drivers are going to behave as we change the pricing. Okay? Again, all of these considerations would be something that the DOJ would be doing if they decide to impose some regulation or think about how to intervene in a particular market. So here I'm going to use it for the case of this Liftago platform. So what the driver does is essentially something which can be described in words very simply. If you want, I'll show you the equations later because the equations are very complicated. It's a dynamic programming problem which results in equations that are sort of roughly a slide long. So I'll impress you with one of those. But in words, it's actually pretty simple. In words, a driver thinks about, okay, am I going to raise the price of the price and hence earn profit, or rather, am I going to lower the price of the ride so that I can earn some profit? If I do that, I am going to give up some outside option, something that I perceive to get if I were to remain in that particular spot I am in. They all like to wait and hopefully catch the guy who is going to pay a lot, after flagging them on the street. And also, they might think that, okay, maybe in like 10 minutes, the demand is going to pick up and prices are going to go up. Maybe a concert is up and, all these people are going to come out and want to get a cab. So then I might not want to leave. Okay? So that's sort of the trade-off that the driver is facing. And so he's thinking about, should I bid more aggressively? Should I sort of lower the price and compete for the consumer versus passing on it and collect the continuation value? Okay? So again, this can be described in equations, as a bunch of value functions. I'm not going to go through these, but just to impress you, this is sort of what the model looks like. Okay? This is what the bidding model looks like, that you're solving and you're seeing what the observed bids are, and you are now turning it on its hat to recover some of the important parameters of this problem that these equations imply. All right. So going back. So now once you do that, you get your supply side estimates. You recover that the average driver on this platform bids about 1/3 higher than what he perceives his costs are. These costs could be, fuel costs. It could be all this perceived business of leaving a location. Okay? So once we have that, we're sort of now ready to start playing these games. We have demand. We know what consumers are going to do if prices are going to change. We have supply. We know what the cab drivers are going to do if we're going to change the pricing algorithm. And we're going to try to think about what the outcome of the market would look like. We're now going into that counterfactual world and simulating it. All right, so let me start with doing a first, I'm going to do that in steps. The first exercise is going to be, rather than having the drivers compete for the consumer and then offer the price that the consumer can choose from, I am going to allow the platform to decouple prices, to basically charge the consumer something very different that it pays the driver. Okay? That's the Uber model, right? Uber pays the drivers something very different than the passengers pay. Okay? So I'm going to start with that. And so what the platform is going to do within my model, within the world I'm thinking about, is use the demand system I have to optimize against that passenger's demand. I'm going to procure the drivers in the most efficient way. So I'm going to, knowing the supply system I have, I'm going to ask the drivers to offer the rides, and I'm going to procure it in the most efficient way. And in the end, what I'll play with is how much information I allow the platform to use to optimize against the passenger's demand, to set the prices. Okay? So let's do that. So there's going to be 3 scenarios, and which I'm going to compare. I'm going to argue in a little bit that this first piece, wrong button, this first piece, the fact that the platform is allowed to charge a different price to consumers and different price to drivers, or rather passengers and drivers, that's going to be the key source of market power in this market. The fact that they are going to observe the history of your rides, that's going to be second order. Okay? Which is an important, if you believe that conclusion, it's going to be a very important, that would be, let's say, a very important consideration for how we should regulate that market. Okay. So let's start with the first counterfactual pricing regime. So the first is going to be, I allow the platform to just charge these 2 different prices, but the price is just a function of the reported driver's cost. So I ask the driver how much they're willing to serve this customer. I pick one of them based on some optimization, and then I'm going to charge something very different to the consumer. So that's what we are going to call uniform pricing, okay, as I talk about the numbers. Then I'm going to allow the platform to use all the betas, okay? So all the betas, I mentioned before that the betas were the preference parameters, the willingness to pay for waiting and how much you hate price increases. So if I assume that I know that as a platform, I can price it. So this is sort of, if you thought about what Uber might be doing today, okay? Because they know exactly where you're leaving from, where you're going. They know exactly when you were rejecting rides, when you were accepting rides. So this is roughly a good description of what that market looks like from Uber's perspective. Finally, we're going to do another counterfactual where these prices are going to be conditioned only on wait times, but not on these betas. So this is like a compromise where the platform would commit never to use the information that they collect on consumers. Very good. So let's look at it. So that's now the big, impressive moment. So this is sort of our baseline. This is where Liftago operates today. Okay, this is what we have within our data set. This is the status quo, let's say. The uniform pricing was the counterfactual where we just decoupled prices. Okay, so we pay different amounts to drivers and different amounts to consumers. Okay, so first observation is that prices are going up a lot. Okay, why is that? Well, because the number of trips that are realized decreases roughly by 30%. Okay, so this 34% number here says that, well, in 34% people more than under uniform pricing choose to take a ride after they see the offer. So a lot of the rides disappeared. Okay, this is what I mentioned that is happening to Uber. As prices went up, because I claim it's because of the decoupled prices, but it's sort of prices went up for Uber, a lot of the rides disappeared, in the US at least. Okay? Whether the platform decides to use or is allowed to use information or not uses information, commits not to use information, has a tiny effect in addition to that. Okay, so that has tiny effect after the prices decoupling. Okay, so first observation. Let's go further. Platform profit. Okay, so now we have that auction. Prices are decentralized. Prices for the ride are being set by drivers competing and consumers choosing. Okay, market sets the price. If instead the platform sets the two prices, we already said a bunch of sales or bunch of rides disappears, but of course platform is going to do really well, right? It's optimizing now, so it must be doing better, but it is doing much, much better. All right, drivers' profits. Oh, poor drivers, right? Their surplus goes down like by a factor of 4. Okay, so that side of the market gets completely busted if we allow the platform to charge different price on the two. Again, not that surprising, right? Right now, the market sets one price that clears the demand with the supply. If we allow the platform to charge two different prices, it's got to be that it's going to squeeze a lot of these potential rents from both of the sides in a much better way. Consumer surplus, again, consumers are worse off, not that by that much, however. It's the drivers that are losing the most. And notice again that in all of these that I was pointing out, the effect of this extra information usage, whether we use these beta coefficients, whether we use all that information that the platform accumulated about the passengers, that's second order. All of that, you see that sort of roughly 1% here, 0.8% here, same for all these other, for the driver profits or consumer surplus cases. Okay? So it's really, for the purposes of our analysis for today, it's really this decoupling of prices. That's key. That the platform, if it is allowed to choose different price that it charges to consumers and different price that it charges to suppliers, whether it be drivers or passengers or other settings, that seems like it's the key problem. Notice that this could have never been proven theoretically. This is a very much empirical question. That's why that's why this field where we try to turn the data into parameters and simulate is so important. Because many of these things that I'm talking about today, including this decoupling being that important, are a function of the estimated parameters themselves. This result might be very different in some other world. So that first step where we use the data to recover these elasticity, substitution patterns, and all these different systems is the key component. Okay, just to conclude, you can simulate these markets and think about the consequences for different types of consumers. Here, what I am showing this picture for is just as a function of this price coefficient and weight coefficients. You might imagine simulating it for different demographics, different areas. All of this is very simple with models of this sort. What this picture tells you is that who would be most hurt if the platform is allowed to decouple these prices are people that are very inelastic, that sort of are willing to travel and get a ride even at higher prices. Not that surprising, I guess. And people that are not willing to wait. Again, not that surprising if you think about it. But the actual numbers and by how much different people get hurt, that's something which is potentially important when calculating damages, let's say, in different cases. All right, so the main takeaway for today from the platform case, from the second case study, is that these match histories, i.e. being able to estimate these different preference parameters, different demand systems at the individual consumer level, that's a great thing for the platform. It can increase the profits, but it really hurts the drivers. But really the most important source of the rents seems to be the fact that the platform is allowed to decouple the prices. And once, if we were to, let's say, force platforms to have prices set by the market, be it by the auction, like in the Liftago case, or by some other mechanism, it seems like, both the providers, suppliers, and the consumers might be better off. Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you during the last hour or so that the economic model is really necessary to be able to evaluate, harm to consumers and firms. We can use it to calculate welfare. We can use it who gets hit and by how much. And in fact, over the last 30 years, 40 years perhaps, there has been a tremendous advance in these econometric methods and modeling tools that can be used. And just to conclude with some numbers, the Department of Justice that I mentioned is one of the most important institutions within the US that deals with antitrust enforcement, has roughly 50 to 60 economists and about 350 lawyers. Okay, so it's about 1-to-6 ratio. Federal Trade Commission, which supervises a lot of things, so it does other stuff that antitrust, it has 120 economists out of 1,300 employees. I tried hard to find some numbers for our own regulator. From 2021, I found that the number was roughly 16 out of 325 employees. So I think there is really a lot of room for improvement. And I would leave it there. So thank you very much.
Jakube, děkujeme za skvělou přednášku. Bude teď prostor pro diskuzi. Já možná zneužiji to, že držím mikrofon a zeptám se rovnou první otázku. Ty jsi mluvil mnoho ve své přednášce o personifikovaných cenách. Ošklivě se tomu říká cenová diskriminace. A když jsi hodnotil důsledky této praxe, tak jsi se zaměřil na cenové dopady. Kdo kolik zaplatí, kdo kolik vydělá. A nemluvil jsi o tom, jak by se lidé cítili, kdyby věděli o této praxi. Což je pro ekonomy velmi typické, já jsem jeden z nich tedy, že se nezabýváme procedurami, nebo zabýváme se procedurami jenom do té míry, že nás zajímají výsledky těch procedur. Ale je dost možné, a to by možná se myslel právník, že lidi budou mít přímo preference o těch procedurách. Běžný občan, kdyby byl věděl, že je možná cenově diskriminován nebo cenově personalifikován, tak by se naštval. A to jaksi nebylo jako součástí tvé analýzy, ani není to součástí standardní ekonomické analýzy, jak mě zajímá, co si o tom jako myslíš.
Tak já bych asi začal tím, že já jsem minimálně na těch datech, která my jsme analyzovali, ukázal, že vlastně ty personifikované ceny nejsou zas takový rozdíl oproti tomu statu quo. Ale obecně samozřejmě to může být problém, ale tak pak bych asi se vrátil k tomu, že jsme všichni ekonomé a dá se na to nastavit cena, tak že Facebook například už si nechá zaplatit za to, aby nepoužíval tvá data. Takže pokud by si s tím měl problém, tak můžeš zaplatit nějakou částku. Nevím přesně, jak by se ta částka počítala, ale nějakou částku a vyhnout se tomu. Tak bych to asi shrnul. Ale určitě to může ovlivnit chování a pak se můžeme bavit o tom, jak by se ten model například pro tu platformu dal obohatit, aby se to dalo zohlednit.
Děkuji a určitě je prostor Štěpáne, proti donesu mikrofon.
Jo, děkuji moc. Dvě otázky u toho prvního případu, kde jako ta lesson learned je, že je tam ta potenciální dynamická situace, když se omezí počet těch kompetitorů, tak když jako od té doby, když už se teda poučili těch 60 ekonomů na DOJ, v jakým procentu případů sleduje se, jako jak často to mají ex ante, right? Protože tohle je krásná analýza, ale je to ex post, takže jako to je o něco jednodušší najít ten model, který to potom fituje a jak to jakoby empiricky vypadá s těma ex ante predikčníma schopnostma toho jako state of art, který existuje na DOJ. A u toho druhého, jako sorry to be dense, jo, jako konec dne, jestli to dobře chápu, tak vlastně veškerá ta identifikace pochází teda z té jedné platformy, ale ty platformy navzájem spolu soutěží jak o zákazníky, tak o ty řidiče. Takže otázka je, jestli jakoby je do toho započtený to, že by se nějak v té simulaci, v té counterfactual, to, že proměníme jako Liftago v další Uber, tak ale ten Uber soutěží, tak jestli jako tohle je tam započtený, nebo jak by se to mohlo chovat, kdyby se to započítalo.
Tak díky, to jsou obě dobré dotazy. hlavně ten druhý, tak k tomu ten si nechám na později, protože tam bude potřeba další odpověď. Tak ten první ohledně těch dynamických efektů v mergerech, tak to bylo něco, co se vlastně přestalo analyzovat na začátku prostě tohoto tisíciletí, protože ekonomové přišli s tím, že vlastně dynamicky se dá zracionalizovat všechno, takže se to těžko dá se to těžko sladit s daty. Takže vlastně se od těchto důvodů, proč zamezit mergeru, spíš ustupovalo. Ta role toho paperu, ze kterého jsem vzal ty výsledky dneska, je právě, aby ukázala, že to možná nebyl dobrý krok. A jak jsem říkal, pokud teda se budeme souhlasit s tím, že to nebyl dobrý krok, tak ta role toho týmu ekonomů je navrhnout ty různé scénáře a pak diskutovat o tom, který z těch scénářů bude nejvíc pravděpodobný a pravděpodobně společně s právníky třeba nějaký scénář se pokusit předem se mu vyhnout nějakými intervencemi. Takových možností, jak se tomu vyhnout, je relativně spoustu. Různé dezinvestice a podobně. Co se týče té druhé otázky, tak máš naprostou pravdu. Ta analýza, kterou jsme dělali dneska, je vlastně na trhu, kde sice jsme tu poptávku, celý ten poptávkový systém a celý ten nabídkový systém dostali z trhu, kde ty platformy soutěží, tak potom modelujeme platformu, která je vlastně monopolista. Pak už úplně ignorujeme ty efekty mezi, co by se stalo, kdyby Liftago změnilo tu svou cenovou politiku, dejme tomu, a místo toho Uber na to nějakým způsobem reagoval. To momentálně v tom modelu není, je to zase něco, co by samozřejmě se tam dalo přidat. Vlastně to, na co jsme se soustředili dneska, nebo v tomhletom článku, je spíš o tom, kde je ten největší zdroj té tržní síly potenciálně pro tu kterou platformu. Takže to je dobrá otázka pro další paper. Ještě nějaká? Tak jestli ne, tak...
Využiju prostoru. Mě překvapují té nízké čísla ekonomických expertů, kteří se tomuto věnují a zejména ve srovnání s obrovskými penězi, která jejich činnost ovlivňuje. A to nejen v Čechách, kdy jsi zmínil číslo 16, ale i v Americe, předpokládám na federální úrovni, kde v tom jako Department of Justice je těch ekonomů jenom 50. Možná tebe to nepřekvapuje, mě jo. Není to tak, že nějaký problém, že těch ekonomů není dost, ale čím to vzniká, že my jako lidstvo nedokážeme najít víc lidí, kteří jsou ochotní a schopní se těmto tématům, které hýbou obrovskýma miliardama, pečlivě věnovat.
Tak tady já bych asi musel spekulovat, ale předpokládám, že v Americe to bude spíš proto, že ten soukromý trh, pokud vznikají někde nějaký damages, tak si to vyřeší sám. Že tohle jsou většinou jako kriminální případy, kdy opravdu dochází k porušování těch základních statutů, jako je ten Clayton Act, Sherman Act a podobně. Ale že to nějak nebrání prostě těm soukromým stranám, aby se soudili navzájem kvůli jiným porušením. A samozřejmě těch ekonomů, kteří se tomu věnují, je daleko víc, jako je celá opravdu skupina litigačních jako econ consulting, jak se tomu říká, firem, econ consulting a litigation firm, kde je těch ekonomů řádově víc, kteří se živí tím, že právě participují na těchto případech a pomáhají jak stranám, které se snaží například meržovat, a stranám, které proti tomu brojí. Takže těch lidí, kteří se věnují této problematice, je řádově víc. Tohle jsou lidi, kteří pracují pro stát a mají jako full-time employment. Nemyslím si, že v Čechách je těch lidí mimo těchto 13-16 o hodně víc.
Budeme se střídat.
Tohle asi není vlastně vůbec otázka na tebe, ale jenom to zkusím si náhodou, nevíš, protože jedna věc je teda zastoupení, nevím, jestli těch 16 má PhD a odkud, jo. Ale pak je ta druhá stránka, prostě když je nějaká litigace mezi firmama, a já mám pocit, jestli bys mi ho potvrdil, že i tam v Čechách jako se nepoužívá ekonomických expertů, nějakých soudních znalců. Existují instituce jako soudních znalců, to třeba založil jednu takovou ministr Němec u pana dekana Ševčíka na hospodářské fakultě, že tam do dneška to funguje. Že? A v principu, kdyby ministerstvo vnitro chtělo, aby existovaly expertízy na ty složitější jako soudní znalce, tak by mohlo podporovat tyhle ty centra těch soudních znalců, ty instituty, aby měli ten aplikovaný výzkum, který jim potom dovoluje dělat kvalitní expertízu pro prostě komerční. Protože ty soudci tohle jako samozřejmě nemůžou prostě nikdy zvládnout. A jestli náhodou nemáš nějakou intuici, proč se tenhle biznis u nás vůbec nerozvíjí, nebo jestli se pletu, že se nerozvíjí? No.
Tak to bohužel vůbec nevím. Já spíš řeknu teda, udělám krok stranou a ohlédnu se k Rakousku, protože tam vím, jak to funguje. Tak tam vím, že si soudci vyberou vlastně svoje experty, kteří ten case můžou prostě nějak, dejme tomu objektivně z pohledu toho soudce zhodnotit, takže vlastně jít skrz všechny ty body analýzy, o kterých jsem dneska mluvil, a vím, že to spoustu kolegů z Rakouska dělá. U nás si nejsem vědom, že by se to dělo vůbec. Takže nějaké prostě best practices v Evropě máme, ale tady jsme se k nim asi ještě nedostali.
Možná je prostor pro poslední otázku. Marek.
Děkuji, díky za skvělou přednášku. Já bych se chtěl zeptat na to, jak se moderní I.O. kouká na to, že řada těch moderních monopolů realizuje tu svou monopolní sílu ne skrze to, že by účtoval jako vyšší ceny, ale skrze jako různý jiný kanály. Například jako za Facebook já neplatím žádný peníze, přesto jako on má nade mnou nějakou monopolní sílu. Můžete říct něco o tomto problému?
Jo, tak jak jsem říkal na začátku, ten model, který já jsem dneska ukazoval, je úplně ten základní, nejjednodušší model, ale to se všechno dá upravovat v závislosti na parametrech a institucích toho kterého trhu. Jak jsem zmiňoval například u těch nemocnic, tak prostě pokud je to vertikální trh, kde firmy uprostřed nějakým způsobem jednají o ceně, místo aby jedna strana diktovala, tak na to už jsou prostě modely v literatuře, které se snaží to adresovat. A samozřejmě čím dál od tohohle jednoduchého modelu jdeme, tím je to složitější. Ale jedním prostě z hlavních pravidel I.O. je, že se snažíme ty instituce respektovat co nejvíc. Tak samozřejmě tam trade-off, jako u každého modelu, že čím více uděláme model realističtější, tím prostě přidáváme stupně volnosti a děláme si vlastně tu práci lehčí. Takže záleží taky na datech. Celý ten obor je vlastně o kompromisech v nějakém momentu. Musíme se snažit napsat model tak, aby byl schopen postihnout ty věci, které si myslíme, že jsou opravdu prvního řádu, a na druhou stranu prostě vynechat věci, se kterými jsme spokojeni, že v modelu nejsou. Ale rozhodně jsou modely samozřejmě daleko komplikovanější než ten, který jsem se dneska snažil nastínit.
Jakube, já ještě jednou děkuji a organizátoři nás zvou na malé pohoštění, kde můžou diskuze pokračovat tímto směrem.
Tak děkuji moc.